Hi, it's Roz and back for another Scallydandle. And I've got 3 books to talk to you about today, all of which I thought were really good books, which is great, but all in quite different ways, which is also great. That's the joy of books, isn't it? That not everything we like has to be the same thing. And up front, I'll say what the 3 are. The first is Agua Viva by Clarice Lispector. This, I think, is an extraordinarily brilliant book, but also deeply scary, actually, as you're reading it, and strange. That's the first one. The second is The Guest Cat by Takashi Hiraide. Probably pronouncing that wrong, apologies. Which is was a runaway bestseller, and I think that might have been something to do with the picture of the cat on the front, but is a superficially simple book that's a lot more complex, perhaps, than it initially seems. Third book, we're on slightly more solid ground, I would say, and that's The Heart is the Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers, and this is a classic of the American South, and but this is a deeply sad book. Really sad. And so, having described those 3, that's probably not altogether inviting, is it? Scary, yes, sort of odd and sad. If you've read any of those 3 books, please do comment in the comments, and because I bet if you've read them, you will also feel that they were good books that you would love to share with other people. So back me up here, okay, if you have. So, starting with the Clarice Lispector. Now, Lispector was born in the Ukraine, but moved to Brazil, and she was 20th century Brazilian novelist, and she died in 1977. And her books are kind of, I think, are now being better recognised gradually as extraordinary and wonderful and classics, I guess, of their kind. So, people say, oh, she should stand with Kafka and Joyce and so on. That's the quote now, as it were. I've only come to her really recently. This is the second Lispector that I've read, and boy, I'm glad to have found her. Having said that, this I will say immediately, this kind of book is not for everyone, so I'm going to talk about it. And if, having heard that, you think I'd rather I don't know, stick needles in my eye than read that book, that's absolutely okay, because we don't all have to like the same thing. So this is not really a novel. I would say it's quite short, novella length. It's more perhaps of a meditation or a reflection. There is no real plot. She spends a lot of the time really trying to say that she's trying to convey the instant, like the moment that she's writing, and then capture something about, she's trying to capture something about existence and I suppose what it is to be human. Lots of writers are ultimately trying to write about what it is to be human, aren't they? What it is to be a person. The narrator, which we kind of assume is Lispector herself, actually moves a bit between being he, she, it. It's predominantly she, it's predominantly her, but it feels like she's talking really directly to us a lot of the time as herself. But then you realise that actually, no, this is a carefully constructed fictional I, and she she's not, this is not literally autobiographical in any way, I think. For example, she describes herself sometimes as a writer, sometimes as a painter, sometimes as a musician, and it's like she wants to use those different modes to kind of explore ideas and be able to use them for sort of metaphors and examples. Sometimes she goes into really beautiful and inspiring detail, like talking about flowers and describing them in terms completely different from the flower itself. It's a bit like, I can't think of what is it, synesthesia. People that hear a word and see it in colour. Almost the way she thinks is not identical to that, but it's like that. Nothing is just what it means. And she says that again and again. She says, "Oh yes, she basically says you've got to look for the meaning between the lines." There is no plot to this book. There is no character other than the narrator, although the narrator's character kind of shifts a bit. Because I think human beings like look for patterns in things, don't they? That's kind of quite hardwired into our consciousness. So reading a book like this, you want to find the patterns, and in a way she keeps not letting you find patterns. She keeps moving on and changing and shape-shifting. Sometimes it seems like she's writing it, say, directly to you. Sometimes she seems to be talking to a former lover, someone who perhaps has broken her heart, but you never really find out more than that, and then that moves again. So you're kind of looking for a story which you don't get, and that could be really frustrating. You could get kind of angry with her, almost like feel a bit cheated or frustrated, or like she's a bit up herself, but you don't, or I didn't, because she's writing from a place often of such pain, really, kind of psychic pain even. And so you go along with her. You want her to work through this, and she's offering you a gift, really, in doing that. It's really hard to do justice by this book in any kind of review, and there's kind of cleverer people out there that probably have done it better. So I think I'm going to stop there. Only adding that when I talk about all that pain, the writer kind of does us a kindness in that she allows her narrator to have a kind of point of grace towards the end of the book, and thank heaven for that, or I might have come away from it kind of quite traumatised. There's a couple of people on BookTube who've also... I was buddy reading this with Alan from Old Blues Chapter and Verse. No, wrong one. Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics. And Noah is another person who's just recently read this and put something up on his channel. So I will link to both of those because that might be interesting if you're intrigued by this. Alternatively, you'll think like, oh, I'm not going anywhere near that. Book number 2 is superficially a much more accessible book. Now, as I say, it's got a really cute cat on the cover. It was written by a Japanese poet in, I think, 2002, but it was published in the West in 2014. It was a bit of a kind of bestseller. And looking on Goodreads, which I did out of curiosity, I think there was quite a lot of people that bought it expecting it to be a kind of a cutesy little thing about cats and how lovely they are, and they were sadly disappointed. So that's your kind of health warning about this book. It's a jewel of a little book. Again, novella length. It's on that boundary between autobiography and fiction. So it's writing about a writer in the 1980s and his wife, and they are the author and his wife, and he said that it is based on his life at that time. And there is a cat in it. This they're renting a house, and the neighbour's cat kind of adopts them, as happens with cats, as we know. Now, and that kind of leads him to thinking about change and the passing of time. It's kind of like about a year, this book. The style is very cool but very detailed, so we get very kind of careful descriptions of the garden with the tank with the water lilies, or kind of detail about them searching for a new place to live because the old woman who owns their house has gone into a care home and is going to sell up. So lots and lots of very precise detail that in theory could be boring, but it isn't, because you kind of get that there's sort of kind of these themes running about kind of loneliness and relationships and connection. And I think, and I'm no expert, that is quite distinctively, there's quite distinctively Japanese things about this book. What's really interesting is I think, say in the UK, we're kind of quite used to the idea of cats that share themselves between different households. In fact, there's a brilliant kids book about it called Six Dinner Sid, about this cat that has 6 different houses where he has 6 different dinners, and eventually he gets fatter and fatter and they will work it out. Now, in this book, it's clear that they're kind of there's a kind of a feeling about privacy in the culture that means that them kind of semi-adopting somebody else's cat was somehow broke some rules of etiquette about kind of relationship between neighbours. I found that really interesting. I found it an absolutely delightful little book, and I'm really, really, really glad to read it. And the fact that I also like cats is irrelevant to the pleasure that I took from this book. Book number 3, Carson McCullers, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Now, this is one of those books that I've meant to read for ages because I've heard of it. I expect lots of people have, and just never got around to for some reason. She wrote it when she was 23. Wow, what a prodigy. It was published in 1940, and it's kind of about 1938 to 1939. It's the style is kind of impressionistic in a way, in that she has like a group of characters that are interconnect or are brought together around a central character, Singer, who's deaf and uses sign language and writing, and they kind of rotate around him, and he in a quite a strange way, I suppose, and you get kind of intimate understanding of each of the different characters in their lives, and you bounce between them and inside their heads, as it were, and it builds up a picture of a time as kind of, I think it's Georgia, probably in the southern states, is where they're living. It looks at class, it looks at race, it looks at what was the sort of the backdrop of what was building up in Europe in terms of fascism. It looks at coming of age and how it feels to be a kind of a sensitive, thoughtful adolescent in a girl in a society that doesn't really give her that space. She loves Mozart and Beethoven, but she doesn't. She has very little access to them. She has to kind of, early in the book, she has to hang around outside people's windows, in the dark, listening to them, listening to things on the radio to reach those things. It's a very moving book, and actually there's a kind of accumulating sadness as you go through it. That said, don't be put off from reading it. There is humour in it, and a real kind of beauty, and a capturing of a place and a time and feelings that I really appreciated. So that's my 3 books. Before I go, I'm going to mention a couple of things that I'm doing in February that I'm going to put in the links below. One is Sagalong, which is, there's a bunch of people on BookTube, including my daughter Tilly, who are hosting this, and it's looking at Norse sagas and doing like a read along of some Norse sagas. So I will link to that, and I'm going to take part, and why don't you? And the other thing that I'm going to be doing in February, March, and April is there's a kind of a read along planned of Ulysses, which I've mentioned before, but I will now link below to the kind of welcome videos for that. There's a couple now, and if you have ever thought, oh, I really ought to read Ulysses, but I'm not too sure about giving it a go. There's a few of us in the group that are reading it that are kind of pretty much Joyce newbies as well, and so this could be your chance to give it a try. Have a good week.